Colleagues, welcome. Thank you for coming to Speaker's House. Some of you will be devotees of the lecture series and therefore frequent attenders here in Speaker's House. Others may be coming to these rooms either for the first time or at any rate for the first time in my memory. This will be a fun occasion and I hope a highly informative one, as frankly all of our lectures have been over the last few years. Tonight, however, our distinguished guest is Jesse Norman. Jesse has a background really slightly untypical in that he is both an academic and someone with a successful career in the private sector behind him. He was educated at Merton College, Oxford, and then went on to take an MPhil at UCL and a doctorate in 2003. And in addition to a career with BZW, he lectured very successfully. So he comes with a somewhat different and more attention-grabbing pedigree than quite a lot of his colleagues. I think he would be regarded as a philosopher in the Conservative Party. He has written on a great many subjects and several texts. For those of you who are interested in conservative philosophy, you might be interested to read his work on Michael Oakeshott, who is widely regarded really as the greatest of the modern conservative philosophers. But tonight, Jesse's going to address us on the subject very dear to his heart of Edmund Burke, about whom he has written a renowned biography. Edmund Burke, philosopher, politician, and prophet. And just before you hear Jesse, bear in mind that amongst all these other things that he's done, he's managed to find time to get himself elected as the chair of the Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee, which has a real prominence in the political debate, not least with arguments about the future of the BBC, and indeed, to mention one other subject, the state of FIFA. So he's got plenty on his plate, but what you're about to hear from him will, I think, be richly satisfying. I hope you will give, friends and colleagues, a very warm welcome to Jesse Norman, Member of Parliament for Hereford and South Herefordshire since 2010. Jesse.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, for that magnificent and wonderfully generous introduction. It is an absolute honour to speak in your house at your invitation and before such a distinguished audience. Edmund Burke made his maiden speech in 1766, 250 years ago, next January the 17th, during the debate on the repeal of the Stamp Act, a parliamentary occasion so tumultuous that it might have tested even your skills in the chamber, Mr. Speaker. Afterwards, Burke wrote to a friend that I felt like a man drunk. Given the circumstances, this might have been a very wise precaution. But it's certainly not an approach that anyone would need in these wonderfully congenial circumstances, unless my lecture prompts them to it. There are many things we think we know about Burke. Among them, the line, "All that is needed for evil to triumph is that good men do nothing," for which there is, alas, no evidence at all. Even during Burke's own life, a myth arose that he was a lickspittle, a creature of the great Whig aristocrats, indeed worse, a turncoat and a traitor to progressive causes because he supported the American colonists and yet bitterly opposed the revolutionaries in France. Thanks to a superb wave of recent scholarship, we can say now with certainty that these claims are false. And there is a strong contrast here with what we now know about Thomas Paine, his most vigorous detractor, a man who had been taken up and supported by Burke, only to turn on him in the most slanderous and dishonourable way, a man who retained the affection of virtually none who knew him well, and who, it now appears, may not even have written key sections of the Rights of Man himself. Let me start then by summing up a little of what we do know and know that we owe to Edmund Burke. The canonical statement of the duties of a Member of Parliament as a political representative. the first theory of the modern political party, much of our understanding of the ideas of revolution, of political reform, and of social value. Some of the most powerful and beautiful writing in the English language, and the greatest statement of what we can now distinctively recognize as conservatism. This, ladies and gentlemen, is an extraordinary achievement. Lord Randolph Churchill once summarized Disraeli's life in these terms: failure, 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 partial success, renewed failure, ultimate and complete triumph. The same might be said of Burke. Even now, 250 years later, it is Burke who offers the deepest critique of modern politics and the greatest hope for its future. He was an Irishman, born in Dublin on the banks of the Liffey in 1730, of a Protestant father and a Catholic mother. He came to political prominence in the 1760s amid perhaps the most intergalactic gathering of talent in British history, the age of Dr. Johnson, of David Hume, Adam Smith, Edward Gibbon, all of whom his friends. Over a long career, he fought 5 great political battles for more equal treatment of the Catholics in Ireland, against what he saw as British oppression of the 13 American colonies, for constitutional restraints on executive power and royal patronage, against the corporate power of the East India Company in India, and most famously against the influence and the dogma of the French Revolution. Their common theme, what W.B. Yeats described in his poem The Seven Sages as Burke's great melody, is his detestation of injustice and of the abuse of power. Even from the outset, Burke was acknowledged as a superlative orator and stylist, and admired as much for his mastery of English prose as for his political wisdom. 2 days after his death, the Times was in no doubt about its verdict. Mr. Burke, it said, will live as long as strength of imagination and beauty of language shall be respected by the world. Dr. Johnson once remarked that he did not begrudge Burke's being the first man in the House of Commons, for he would be the first man everywhere. And Boswell once said of him in Parliament, it was astonishing how all kinds of figures of speech crowded upon him. He was like a man in an orchard where boughs loaded with fruit hung about him, and he pulled apples as fast as he pleased and pelted the ministry. Burke's great speech on conciliation gives some flavour of his oratory. The date is March 1775, and the American colonies are in uproar over the hated tea tax and the high-handedness of Lord North's administration. Burke makes one last despairing attempt to bring Parliament to its senses. His message is plain and bold. The proposition is peace. Not peace through the medium of war, not peace to be hunted through the labyrinth of intricate and endless negotiations, not peace to arise out of universal discord or to depend on the juridical determination of perplexing questions. It is simple peace, sought in its natural course and in its ordinary haunts. It is peace sought in the spirit of peace. Why conciliate? Because America should not be coerced and could not be overcome, given her distance, her rapidly expanding population, and her growing commercial strength. But most of all, because of the American spirit itself. Burke said, in this character of the Americans, a love of freedom is the predominating feature. This fierce spirit of liberty is stronger in the English colonies, probably, than in any other people of the earth. We cannot falsify the pedigree of this fierce people and persuade them that they are not sprung from a nation in whose veins the blood of freedom circulates. Your speech would betray you. An Englishman is the unfittest person on earth to argue another Englishman into slavery. The speech on conciliation retains its power to this day. Part poem, part sermon, part homily. It is a stylistic hybrid. Again and again, Burke shows his extraordinary ability to ascend from particular detail to timeless Olympian generalization. A nation is not governed, which is perpetually to be conquered, is one such. Or this, genuine simplicity of heart is an healing and cementing principle. Magnanimity in politics is not seldom the truest wisdom, and a great empire and little minds go ill together. But the speech on conciliation also marked a small but important watershed in political communications. Speeches by parliamentarians had been published before, but Burke's decision to rework and publish major speeches is a deliberate innovation, and these marked some of the earliest occasions on which publication had been self-consciously used to build a basis of shared knowledge and understanding within politics, a reputation outside Parliament, even for a backbencher, and indeed such was the interest that his speeches attracted in America, a degree of international renown. In his 5 great political battles, Ireland, the American colonies, executive power, royal patronage, East India Company, and against the French Revolution, Burke's record of practical achievement was mixed. He often overreached himself. He was a backbencher for almost all of his 30 years in Parliament, rarely exercising real political power. And he was variously denounced as vainglorious, a blowhard, and an irrelevance. His private life was blighted by debt, which he was unwilling to relieve by the means of self-enrichment usual for the time. He offended George III by his severe criticisms of royal influence and by his support for a regency during the king's period of madness. A man of enormous personal warmth and good humour, Burke lost friends and supporters by his nearly obsessive insistence on the campaigns of the moment. Yet the extraordinary fact is not that Burke was occasionally wrong, but that he was so often right. Not only that, he was right for the right reasons. Not through luck, but because his powers of analysis, imagination, and empathy gave him an extraordinary gift of prophecy. Thus he foresaw the effects of British rule in Ireland. He foresaw the loss of the American colonies, the overreach of the East India Company, and the disastrous consequences of revolution in France. For Burke, as for Aristotle, the essence of politics is public deliberation through argument and debate. Public power is made legitimate by being held to account. And so governments must be persuasive and not coercive if they are to exercise just authority. So far, so familiar. But Burke extends this analysis in 3 important ways. First, he insists that private power, too, must be capable of being held to account, at least when it affects public well-being. Hence his campaign to bring the East India Company to heel, finally by dragging Warren Hastings, Governor-General of Bengal, 3,000 miles back to Westminster to face impeachment charges. Secondly, Burke makes the positive case for political parties. For Burke, a party is, and I quote, a body of men united for promoting by their joint endeavours the national interest upon some particular principle in which they are all agreed. Thus, parties are not like factions which come and go based on specific causes and specific interests. Rather, they bring stability, open debate, and a focus on the national interest to politics. They moderate and control government, and they recruit and test people for public life. Paradoxically, political parties make politics cleaner than it is when factions predominate. But thirdly, the effective functioning of parties is subject to a vital caveat. Everyone here will recall the words of Burke's famous address to the electors of Bristol, 1774. Your representative owes you not his industry only, but his judgment, and he betrays that judgment if he sacrifices it to your opinion. This is the most definitive statement of the duties of a Member of Parliament. But it's easy to forget what else he says in that. Parliament is not a congress of ambassadors from different and hostile interests. Parliament is a deliberative assembly of one nation with one interest, that of the whole, where not local purposes, not local prejudices ought to guide, but the general good, resulting from the general reason of the whole. You choose a member indeed, but when you have chosen him, he's not a member of Bristol, but he is a member of Parliament. One wonders how Burke would have reacted to the recent debate over English votes for English laws. The lesson is clear. Members of Parliament must be independent-minded, but they must temper that spirit with loyalty. Parties must be strong and disciplined enough to hold government to account, but not so partisan that they lose sight of the public interest and undermine the deliberative function of Parliament. It is a demanding vision for politics, but it is one that has proved its value time and time again. Yet if we turn now from the 18th century, we can see that Burke also foresaw some of the greatest discontents of the modern age. Here, if I may, I'm going to be a little bit more contentious. From a Burkean perspective, the extreme liberalism and individualism of the present day now appear to be in crisis. Various disasters have seriously undermined conventional beliefs in the moral primacy of the individual, in the power of human reason alone to resolve political and economic problems, and in the capacity of unfettered human freedom to deliver personal or social well-being. In politics alone, the White House under John F. Kennedy gathered together one of the greatest assemblages of expertise ever seen in American politics, and they took their country into Vietnam. Western policy towards Russia in the 1990s was heavily economic in inspiration, focusing on currency convertibility and free market institutions. It all but ignored the country's low levels of trust and social capital, and actively assisted the loss of public assets at fire sale prices to the new oligarchs. The new currency of the euro was introduced and has been sustained as an elite project which deliberately ignores long-standing concerns about the huge differences in the societies and the economies of the various nations involved, and about the legitimacy of the eurozone surrounding institutions. Yet Burke also reminds us of the threats within Western societies themselves. For there is increasing evidence that extreme liberalism causes people to lose sight of the true sources of human well-being and to become more selfish and individualistic by priming them with ideas of financial success and celebrity. In his own time, Burke regarded as his greatest achievement his campaign to restrain the crony capitalism of the East India Company and to insist on the accountability of private power to legitimate public authority. In effect, he offers a profound critique of the market fundamentalism now prevalent in Western society. But this critique comes not from the left of the political spectrum, but from the right. Markets are not idolized, but treated as cultural artifacts mediated by trust and tradition. Capitalism becomes not a one-size-fits-all ideology of consumption, but a spectrum of different models to be evaluated on their own merits. Burke would note, I think, the extraordinary greed and self-dealing seen over the past decade by the modern nabobs of the financial services in a series of cartels disguised as markets. The absence of much effective national regulation and supervision, the narrowing and fragmentation of political parties and of their semi-public role within political deliberation, the emergence in America of corporate super PACs, political action committees, exploiting the constitutional protection of free speech to spend unlimited amounts of independent money on political campaigning. Yet, as he shows us, the individual is not simply a compendium of wants, and human happiness is not simply a matter of satisfying individual wants. Its purpose is to preserve a social order which addresses the needs of generations past, present, and future, what he calls a partnership between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are yet to be born. Philosophically, he insists against Hobbes and the social contract theorists that there never was or ever could be a state of nature. Humans are social animals and their nature is to be in society. The human self is an active social force, not the passive vehicle for happiness of the utilitarians or the individual atoms of much modern economics. The paradox of Burke's conservatism is thus that, properly understood, it is intrinsically modest, while extreme liberalism appears to promote arrogance and selfishness. His small c conservatism constrains rampant individualism and the tyranny of the majority, while extreme liberalism threatens to worsen their effects. He tempts us to the heretical thought that the route to a better politics may not be through more and louder managerial claims, but through a deep change of viewpoint. In his own political life, Burke was devoted to an ideal of public service and duty, and deplored the tendency to individual or generational arrogance and what he called the ethics of vanity. His thought is imbued with the importance of history and memory and an almost Orwellian detestation of those who would erase them. He insists on the importance of human allegiance and identity and on manners, sentiment, and prejudice, that is, the wisdom that is accumulated and embedded over time in social institutions and social networks. As he said, we are afraid to put men to live and trade each on his own private stock of reason, because we suspect that this stock in each man is small, and that the individuals would do better to avail themselves of the general bank and capital of nations and of ages. Burke cautions us against a levelling spirit that ignores history in favour of individual flair or personal inspiration. As he remarked of Lord North, the man urges us to consult our invention and reject our experience. Nowhere is this more obvious than in relation to constitutional issues. Burke likened the British Constitution to an old building which stands well enough, though part Gothic, part Grecian, part Chinese, until an attempt is made to square it into uniformity. Then it may come down upon our heads altogether in much uniformity of ruin, and great will be the ruin thereof. And so, I'm afraid, it is proving to be. I cannot resist pointing out that those who were concerned at the House of Lords vote last night might care to reflect that such votes should be commonplace, as would party political partisanship in an elected Lords. That's just a bit of a tease, ladies and gentlemen. To return, for these reasons, Burke is deeply hostile to radical change and to what has been called the politics of the felt need, change which often springs from a foolish and egoistic desire to impose oneself on the world, and which unsettles human arrangements and destroys social value. This is the deep explanation for why Burke urged conciliation with the American colonists and attacked the French Revolution. In both cases, he's seeking to protect a settled social order and a settled way of life from upheaval. This is a fundamentally principled and consistent position. Burke, then, was no turncoat, but equally, he was no friend of settled injustice either. Instead, he gives us the most nuanced account we have of the nature of political reform. Of course, on occasion, as in a time of war, sudden and radical change may be required. But as a rule, governments should be committed to reform, and reform should be early, anticipating the emergence of a problem before its full effects are felt. It should be proportionate to the evil to be addressed, to limit collateral effects. It should be incremental, building on existing arrangements so that it can draw on any lessons learned from them. It should be measured so that those making the change and those affected by it can adjust their behaviour accordingly. It should be consensual so that it can last over time. It should be cool in spirit to maintain consensus throughout the process of change. And finally, each step must be practical and achievable in itself. Early, proportionate, incremental, measured, consensual, cool in spirit, and practical. I would ask you this, ladies and gentlemen, how much modern legislation would satisfy these tests? There can be little doubt that the answer is far too little across every political party. Finally, Burke also questions the self-image of the present political and media class, in which it appears that there is no truth, but only different kinds of narrative deployed in the service of power. Instead, he gives us principles that do not change, the sanction of history and the moral authenticity of those willing to give up power to principle. He gives us again what I would call the lost language of politics, language of honour, of loyalty, of duty and wisdom, which can never be captured adequately in any spreadsheet or economic model. Burke, then, is ripe for reassessment. But in rediscovering his riches today, we do no more than did the Lake poets after his death. Like other bien-pensants of the day, they were initially euphoric about the French Revolution, as Wordsworth wrote in his great masterpiece, The Prelude. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. They were also repelled by Burke's politics, with Coleridge denouncing the older man as a turncoat in a sonnet of 1794. Yet never, Burke, thou drankst corruption's bowl, thee stormy pity and the cherished lure of pomp and proud precipitance of soul, wildered with meteor fires. It's a pretty tough indictment. But with the passage of time and the growth of experience, both men fell under the influence of Burke. Coleridge's now forgotten final book on the constitution of church and state blends Burkean ideas with British common law and church traditions and a heavy dose of continental philosophy. As for Wordsworth, his late revisions to the Prelude made his own feelings all too clear. Genius of Burke, forgive the pen seduced by specious wonders. I see him old but vigorous in age, stand like an oak whose staghorn branches start out of its leafy brow the more to awe the younger brethren of the grove. What caused this elegant recantation? Simply the French Revolution. Perhaps I may close by revisiting that extraordinary moment with you tonight. In 1789, the initial reaction in Britain to the fall of the Bastille was sanguine and remained so for some time. Realists were not generally dismayed to see the country's historic enemy shattered and humbled, while progressives and radicals rejoiced at what they regarded as the triumph of Enlightenment ideals against intolerance and inequality. Charles James Fox was exultant. How much the greatest event it is that ever happened in the world, and how much the best, he wrote. The revolution was regarded as a brief upheaval which would quickly yield to good order, indeed to a constitutional monarchy. Pitt himself fatefully declared to the Commons in February 1790 that the present convulsions of France must sooner or later terminate in general harmony. Thus circumstanced, France would enjoy just that kind of liberty which I venerate. But one man did not share the general optimism. In his book, Reflections on the Revolution in France, Burke shows himself the Celtic Vartes, the seer, inspired by cold passion and intellectual energy, prophesying the future when all around are imbued in fantasy, folly, and self-congratulation. This is no great event. He says no general harmony, no liberty to be venerated. It is a catastrophe. It will not lead to good order or to the ideal society anticipated by the radicals, the intellectuals, and their fellow travellers. No, the French Revolution is not ended. What lie in store are violence, bloodshed, anarchy, terror, and civil strife. Far from settling down, France will spread an international spirit of sedition that will infect Britain, and the result of her revolution will be war. Events were to prove him triumphantly and tragically right. We know today that while the French Revolution was expected to end privilege, destroy elites, enfranchise the poor, and break the power of the church, it did none of these things, and at the cost of tens of thousands, arguably hundreds of thousands of lives. Yet Burke's greatest prophecy still remained to be fulfilled. In the Reflections, he had written, "In the weakness of one kind of authority and in the fluctuation of all, the officers of an army will remain for some time mutinous and full of faction, until some popular general who understands the art of conciliating the soldiery and who possesses the true spirit of command will draw the eyes of all men upon himself. Armies will obey him on his personal account. There is no other way of securing military obedience in this state of things. But the moment in which that event shall happen, the person who really commands the army is your master. The master that is little of your king, the master of your assembly, the master of your whole republic." The king would be dead already, but otherwise this is a frighteningly exact description of the emergence of Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1793, the young general was already making a name for himself with the siege and seizure of the port of Toulon. In 1799, he staged a coup d'etat, naming himself first consul and moving into the Tuileries. By 1804, he would be Emperor of France. A year later, he would be master of continental Europe. Thank you very much indeed.